Giants. Hulking monsters that look just like us. Muscle-bound might and ancient rulers of the land. They terrorize villages, eat livestock, and use our bones as toothpicks. They are icons of folklore and legend. Hello adventurers, I am the Welsh DM, the one Welshman whose accent was traded for a golden egg with a giant. Giants are iconic in fantasy TTRPGs. The D&D Player's Handbook from 2014 even has one on the front cover, and yet I so rarely see them used in games. And I think they're really interesting monsters with all of their background and their establishment in folklore that it feels like a shame. So in this edition of the Bestiary, we're going to go through giants, what we can do with them from a campaign perspective, some adventures we can use them for, and how we can use them in an encounter, as well as spicing up their stat block to make them a little bit more exciting and interesting to use. As always, a lot of the commentary of this is probably going to circle around D&D 5th edition, regardless of the year of its iteration, but it will apply to pretty much any fantasy RPG. Whether that's Pathfinder, Daggerheart, or Tales of the Valiant, there is something for everyone who plays fantasy TTRPGs. Let's start off with the themes and tones that giants portray when we use them in narratives and storytelling. We can break this down into two particular ideals, folklore and fantasy RPG representation of giants. In folklore, giants are so often portrayed as mighty beings set on destruction. They rampage through the countryside, destroying towns and villages left and right until some plucky, crafty hero comes along to defeat them. In Celtic mythology, they're often also kings who have carved out their own landscape and have their own tales of how they rose to such power of prominence. Giants, at their core, are just like us. They are very large humanoids, and so they act in similar ways to us, except they weaponize their size, their muscular strength, and their brutality over the little folk, turning their bones into bread and using the rest as toothpicks. The nature of giants being just like us, only bigger, begs the question of can the small and big folk live side by side in a symbiotic relationship, or are they always destined to come to blows in a predator-prey-like situation? Stories that lean to that antagonistic status always have the heroic villain using agility, wits, and cunning to defeat the giants, outthinking them rather than taking them on in a straight fight. These are the kind of stories that we can look to tell through folklore with giants, about how plucky adventurers can overcome the giant's strength using their own tactical nous and the environment around them, rather than just taking them on in a straight fight. As mentioned, Celtic mythology, especially Irish and Welsh, has plenty of stories of giants to draw upon for our own campaign inspiration, as do Nordic legends with the tales of their gods and giants going to war. Using existing folklore in the world is just good sense when designing our TTRPG campaigns. On the flip side, we have D&D and the other RPGs inspired by it and what they've done with giants. And particularly what we see is they've tied giants very closely into the elemental planes. We have stone, fire, frost, and storm giants all very closely linked to each of the four primary planes of elemental power. It poses us a really interesting question of what we can do with those kind of stories where giants are so tied to the elemental plane that perhaps that shapes their decision making and their goals upon the material plane. We don't just have to use giants as brute force destruction on a town, but instead they can be trying to invoke certain elemental power in certain areas to whatever goals that you see fit. Another aspect of D&D's lore on giants is the ordning. The ordning is a very interesting concept in that giants of different types sit in a certain hierarchy, with storm giants at the top and hill giants, ogres, trolls, etc. at the bottom. This speaks to a cultural class system within giants that we can see in the real world the implications that has. Yes, they're destructive forces, but they're destructive forces with rules and caste systems that mean they all have to behave when others tell them what to do. How does that shape a giant's actions when a fire giant does a certain thing, knowing that a storm giant could tell them to do something different? Storm King's Thunder does an interesting job of doing this from D&D 5th edition, explaining the ordning and questioning how it behaves when others try to rise through the ranks. Of course, this is a topic that probably should be discussed in Session Zeros, as it has certain negative connotations in the real world that some players might not feel comfortable exploring. As always, good Session Zeros make for great campaigns. And lastly, from D&D's lore on giants, we have dragons. We discussed dragons in a previous video in the Bestiary series, which you can catch up there. But in D&D lore, dragons and giants are mortal enemies, ancient enemies from a previous war long since burnt out. This gives us a lot of opportunities to explore these two powerful and iconic branches of monsters and potentially tell an interesting story that combines the two of them. In my world in particular, they were created for opposite purposes. Dragons were created to defend the material plane, while giants were created to act as a force to break the elemental power that was creating the material plane and release it back to the elemental titans. This foundational piece of lore is something that can be explored through narratives and storylines. A great question to ask for your own setting is, why do both have elemental power? Was it that giants were given elemental power first, coming from the elemental planes, and dragons developed it to counter them in the ensuing war? Or did giants, through a process of natural selection due to their hunting of dragons, end up with elemental resistances to better combat the giants that they were trying to kill? With those themes, tones, and concepts put together and our campaign starting to take shape, we need to come up with a plot hook, the thing that's going to sink into our players and drag them into the narrative that we're writing. Here are just 3 ideas that you can possibly use in your campaign for giant-related adventures. Save the town is a classic concept for giants as they come along to try and wreck up a town or village that the players are in. Attack on Titan is a great source material for what you're trying to do with this adventure, as giant humanoid beasts bear down on a defended town, and it is up to the heroes to thwart the giants' destruction. With news that giants are bearing down on the town, the mayor has hired the adventurers to help them protect the town from destruction. Give your players 1 to 2 hours to prepare themselves, to set traps, establish defences, train the militia of the town as to what's to come, and be ready for when the giants arrive. When they do, the challenge is not just to defeat the giants, make them leave or kill them all, it's also to make sure there is as minimal collateral damage to the town as possible. The goal is to stop the giants from destroying critical infrastructure and harming civilians, not just defeating the giants full stop. This is a perfect one-shot for when everything's been a bit roleplay heavy and your tactical combat players are needing a bit of an itch to scratch. It's a simple fight the giants with an added layer of complexity and a chance to flex the creative, tactical muscles that players don't often get to do. The Giant Dragon Dispute adventure takes the premise of giants and dragons not getting along and puts the little folk in the middle of it. A giant clan and an ancient dragon have learnt that their territories border each other, and neither is happy with it and both want to claim the other's territory. Unfortunately for everyone else, their towns are in the way of this bubbling conflict, and they desperately need someone to sort it out before it boils over into full-on battle. The party, as known adventurers, are hired to act as intermediaries between the giants and the dragon to come to some sort of peace deal where the territories can be established and to make sure that no one is hurt in the process. It is an awful big challenge because as giant creatures who see the land as their own, they're not really concerned with the little folks' requests or needs. So instead, the party needs to think outside the box and consider the needs and wants of bigger creatures rather than just themselves. Of course, if things go well, great, it's a brilliant roleplay adventure. If things go badly, you end up with a really deadly encounter in the middle of it that your players might want to join in and have some fun with as well. It's a win-win. And the third idea is Jack and the Beanstalk. Yes, I'm ripping this one straight off the book. Everyone loves a good heist concept, and Jack and the Beanstalk is one of the most classic heist stories of all time. The rogue sneaking in, stealing the golden goose and making it out before the giant has a chance. Do this with an entire party, having them sneak through the giant's castle. As a GM, you then get to explain the absolute majesty, grandiose size of a giant's architecture that'll make your players feel small and insignificant, but also like sneaky mice that are moving their way through the castle unseen. That is until the party encounter the giant's pet cat, a dire lion, that is going to chase down these mice and try to get them out of its master's home. Do the party succeed on getting the treasures out of the giant's castle? Well, then you've got an exciting chase down the remaining beanstalk as the giant chases them down. Does a party member sacrifice themselves to buy the rest time? Do they get ahead of things and do the classic chop down the beanstalk? That's for your players to decide, but it'll be exciting nonetheless. Side note, if you want more advice on running heist adventures, I recommend going over to the DM's Guild and getting Beyond the Golden Vault. It was an expansion to the Golden Vault book by D&D and contains rules and guidelines on how to set up heist adventures, including some pre-written heist locations that you can just drag and drop into your game. There'll be a link somewhere. So we've got our adventure, we've got our themes and tones. Now we want to get ready for the fight with the giants. Unfortunately, the giant stat blocks, at least the ones presented in the 2014 Monster Manual, suck. They are incredibly dull, they're all basically the same, just changing the amount of damage or hit points the monster has, and are lacking a certain excitement factor that you would expect from fighting something that's 10-20 feet tall. The first thing I'm going to recommend is the same thing I recommended with dragons previously, and that's to give giants AoE attacks. It's not something we see in D&D at all, really, but the idea of a giant's club doing a 10-foot cube amount of targets rather than a single target will help us get across the idea that these giants are huge, they're massive, their blows destroy buildings, not just individual people. Players will be concerned about being near each other and have to focus on their maneuverability and dexterity rather than just banding together and attempting to fight the giant, which is the theme that we want to get across. These giants are big, the way to beat them is with brains and dexterity, not with brawn. Other things you can do in the similar vein is you can change the rock throw from a single target into a line attack, hitting everybody on that line as this giant rock just goes flying through the air, smashing everybody out of the way. And if you want to get really spicy, stolen again from Attack on Titan, have the giant crush that rock into shrapnel and then scatter it in a cone blast of rocky shards that just hits and stabs into people as they're caught unawares by the giant's ability to adapt to the situation. We want to keep players guessing while at the same time feeling like the monster itself is powerful and able to do things that they couldn't possibly dream of. Second point, can anyone from Wizards please comment on this video and tell me why giants don't deal elemental damage? You have a giant called a frost giant, it doesn't deal cold damage. A fire giant doesn't deal fire damage. We are told that they are linked to the elemental planes and yet they show no signs of it in their attacks. So, I would recommend adding elemental damage to a giant's attacks. It doesn't have to be a lot, but it gets across the feeling that the players are fighting a creature that is touched by the elemental planes. You can do the same with their rock throws, giving them an element of elemental damage. Just imagine the imagery of a frost giant actually throwing icebergs, or a magma giant is throwing pyroclastic flow, instead of just being a generic rock that happens to be lying around. If you want to keep ramping up the danger and the elemental feel and represent a giant that's fully in touch with its elemental nature, you could give them an aura effect. I wouldn't have the aura deal damage, but instead focus on debuffs and status conditions. Maybe the fire giant has a heat metal aura. Anyone within 5 to 10 feet finds their weapons heating up as if the heat metal spell is happening to them. Or maybe the storm giant takes away reactions like the shocking grasp cantrip. Little things that force players to think about the interaction that they're having with the giants rather than just trying to brute force the encounter. Speaking of trying to brute force the encounter, I don't think a giant should die from being stabbed in the calf muscle 20 times. It's kind of unimpressive. Giants are huge creatures and their weak spots, their vital organs, are much higher up than where the players usually are. Shadow of the Colossus is the game that comes to mind. I want players to have to find and climb and reach a point on the giant where it is vulnerable and going to do a lot of damage to bring it down. If you're inclined, you could give a giant resistance to damage from creatures that are on the ground, and only creatures that as they get higher up do they overcome the resistance, and maybe even get automatic criticals when they directly attack their head with a melee weapon. Who doesn't want their character to bravely climb up the back of a giant and start hacking away at its neck, shoulders, rib cage? It's Legolas on top of the Oliphant. It's not fun just hacking away at something at the bottom. You want to do something badass climbing on top of it. Something I would like to do is have the giant begin to freak out when there are like 4 or so medium creatures climbing all over it. I mean, if you had 4 or 5 spiders climbing all over you and stabbing you with knives, I think you would be freaking out too. So maybe impose a kind of panic effect on the giant when enough of the player characters are on it. And finally, and aptly finally, what happens when a giant dies? It is a giant lumbering behemoth that when it's brought down is not going to fall gently or gracefully. It's going to collapse and destroy whatever it falls onto. When a giant dies, you should roll a random direction, have the giant fall in that direction, and anything underneath it is going to take damage, as this lumbering shadow teeters and totters before finally falling over, and everyone needs to panic and run. This idea has been stuck in my brain since Warhammer Fantasy, where they did that with giants. They even had a special template to showcase what creatures were hit by it when it did fall over. It's fun, it's whimsical, it's memorable, and it's a really impactful way for a fight to end, and it makes the players feel like they defeated something that's big and hefty. The Monster Grimoire from Grim Hollow does something similar with the Puck Tree, so I know it's possible, I just think every giant should do it as well. And imagine the situation where your players figure this out for the next time they encounter a giant and try to use it to their advantage. They try and get the giant to fall in a certain direction to minimize the damage or avoid squashing them. Or even, they try to get the giant to fall into another giant and start a domino effect down the giant line, knocking them all prone. It doesn't just have to be dangerous, it can be funny too. We've got our themes, we've planned our adventure, and we've got our stat block ready to go, which means it's now time for the climactic encounter, where the giant has climbed down the beanstalk and is bearing down on the party that stole its golden goose. The party are going to have to defeat the giant or the village is going to get destroyed. How do we make the encounter exciting and memorable, not just with the stat block, but with everything around it? The first thing I would consider with pretty much any encounter, but especially giants, is the terrain. We've spoken how giants tend to be destructive forces, especially on civilization and architecture. An encounter against a giant is going to lead to destruction of buildings, walls, towers. So put these in the encounter. Give the giant opportunity to destroy the surroundings around it, not just hit the players. It adds to the cinematic narrative of the encounter and provides an opportunity for players to have to mitigate other things rather than just dealing damage. All giants have the ability to throw a rock on their stat block, but what is that rock depends on the situation around them. It could be a chunk of a building, it could be a wagon just left out on the street. It adds to the narrative of the encounter when you change a monster's stat block to react to the environment they're in. When the giant then throws that boulder and the player dodges out of the way, it probably crashes into the building that the player was standing in front of. Everything has consequences. The collateral damage is what we're going for here. Perhaps even as the fight prolongs, the giant needs to up their defense, so they just rip the roof off the top of a building and start using it as a tower shield. Touching back on the throwing element of giants and how they all throw rocks. Why does it have to be a rock? Why can't it be a person? If the players are climbing on top of the giant to try and get to those weak spots, the giant's probably going to grab them and hurl them across the battlefield, probably into a building, destroying something in the process. Giants with their brute strength can force an element of maneuverability on the encounter because they can push and throw the player characters to ensure that the fight doesn't become a standstill, hit and deal damage slogfest that encounters can kind of turn into. Keep the encounter dynamic with the giant always changing up the situation and forcing the players to have to react to how their situation changes. And lastly, with giants, more than almost any creature, it's worth thinking about the verticality of your encounter. A lot of encounters, especially when you're using a map or a VTT, can feel quite two-dimensional, like everything is happening on the same plane. And if you do that with giants, you lose a sense of their scale and impressive size. To that end, I would recommend when designing the battlefield of the encounter to make sure there are multiple different height levels at which the fight can take place. There might be player characters fighting on the ground floor, there might be some on a building, there might be some at the top of a tree, all of them providing different benefits and disadvantages depending on where the fight is taking place. We want the players to be able to take the fight to the giant at the giant's height, not just be little insects running around its feet. We spoke about them being able to climb on a giant. Well, it's easier to climb a giant when you're already standing on top of a building than having to start from the floor. Or we can take further inspiration from Attack on Titan, give our players grappling hooks and harpoons with rope that they can throw into the giant and then start climbing on top of them. These are the tools that we can use to make sure that the fight is vertically interesting, not just dramatically, cinematically, or narratively interesting, adding further tactical complexity to the fight and engaging players' brains in a different way. And that's Giantkin. I personally haven't used giants in a while, but in writing this video, I'm actually really excited to go away and use them in an upcoming adventure and use all of these ideas that I've written down. So hopefully you too are excited to go wreck some towns and villages, steal some livestock, and use your player character's bones as toothpicks. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and perhaps leave a comment as to what kind of giants are your favourites and the best story you've told with them in your adventures. And as always, if you want to see more videos like this, do hit the subscribe button and hit the bell notification to make sure you never miss a video. There will be more Bestiary videos coming, always added to the playlist. There is the playlist probably somewhere around here for you to go check out for all the previous ones as well. Anyway, I do believe that's it. Nothing more to say on giants for now, so until we do this again, you keep an eye out for dragons. I'm going to go see if I can steal that giant's golden goose, and I'll see you next time.